I remember sitting in my neurology class and being told there's nothing that we can do for dementia. Like as a naturopath, to suggest otherwise it would be to give people false hope. Don't do that.
My director of research, a former practicing physician, described dementia as one of the cruelest diseases. Frustratingly, for all involved, the patient does not even know what is going on and may not suffer as much as those that love and care for the patient. Our next speaker is going to clear the air about dementia and provide practical guides to navigate and hopefully avoid this scary situation. Dr. Heather Sandison specializes in neurocognitive medicine, including autism, ADD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, and dementia.
I can only speculate why people would be trying to suppress such a hopeful message around Alzheimer's, where we have peer-reviewed clinical trials supporting that we're getting these great outcomes. My work is dedicated towards changing that narrative because I've watched people suffering with dementia, suffering with cognitive decline, terrified of what life is going to look like as they age. Our focus was not the surrogate marker of beta-amyloid. It was cognition, which is like, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's what matters to people is, can I dress myself? Can I cook for myself? Can I live independently? Can I go to the bathroom on my own? Do I have my dignity at the end of my life? That's what's really important, not the number of beta amyloid, right? It gives us some indication because it's this response to some other cause. It's not the end all be all. It's not what's important to human being.
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms. Dr. Sandison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. It's great
I just
to be
said
here.
Sanderson, didn't I? And it's Sandison, and I would get it right from here on. So you got your first degree for 5 years. You were doing some fun stuff. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And then you've got into naturopathic medicine. Talk about that time period and what drove you in that direction.
Yeah, so I went to undergrad in San Francisco and with the plan of going to UCSF. It's the best medical school on the West Coast, or it was at the time. And I was really inclined to go towards healthcare and medicine. I wanted to make a difference in other people's lives to help them live their best life and be most effective, be able to bring their gifts to the world. Right? I had seen growing up that people who were sick, they weren't going to neighborhood board meetings, right? They weren't showing up. They were busy going to doctor's appointments and distracted by their health and the need for health care. And so in my mind, it was like, okay, if I could be a doctor, I could help people live their life, not have to deal with that. And so I imagined that the conventional medicine was the way to do that. And then when I was in undergrad, I had my own health issues come up. And the person who helped me most was a craniosacral therapist, a DO, an osteopathic doctor. And she suggested that I look into naturopathic medicine. And I was fortunate enough that the school I went to had actually a course in naturopathic medicine. It was one of the few places in the world that had that. And I went ahead and took the course, and it became just a matter of when, not if. And so I spent a few years. I knew I was going to take on, it was just very practical. I was like, all right, I'm going to be in debt after I finish naturopathic school. So I'm going to get my wiggles out. And I traveled around the world for a couple of years. I worked as a marine biologist for a little while. And I kind of got the travel bug out so that I could buckle down and really give my all to my career after that. And so I went to Bastyr, the naturopathic school in Seattle, and got a great education there. And really that gave me a foundation for what I've done since.
Wow. So one of the things you said that you were kind of always leaning towards medicine, participating in PTA. At home, were your parents, were they involved in stuff or not involved in stuff because of health problems? And you're like, this is how people should live? Or did that influence you in some way to move towards medicine?
My mom is a nurse. She worked as a nurse for a long time. And my grandpa had been a pharmacist. So there was some medicine, but more I was interested in health more than anything. And that was really what made me decide on naturopathic school, is that I didn't want to focus on disease, but more on health and how people could be the most effective, most fully, just live their potential.
Very cool. And then what caused you to kind of focus on kind of the brain and dementia and your current focus?
Yeah, I think at first it was a challenge. I had learned over and over again in school. I remember sitting in my neurology class and being told there's nothing that we can do for dementia. Like as a naturopath, to suggest otherwise it would be to give people false hope. Don't do that. And that was really kind of disheartening to me, but also it was like this challenge, right? It was like, well, you can't do anything about this. And I was like, wait, what? Maybe we can. And then I heard Dr. Bredesen, my mentor, speak at a conference. It was an integrative mental health conference. And what he was presenting were these cases, a series of cases where that had actually happened. People had reversed their cognitive decline on the way to Alzheimer's. And the way he described it was essentially stacking all of naturopathic medicine on top of each other, doing all of it at once, and then getting these really incredible, miraculous outcomes. And it made sense to me. It made sense to me that if we could stack these interventions, you would get even more potentiation of them. You would get even better benefit. And so I went ahead and did his course. I went and did his additional training through IFM. And when I came back, I was on the list of people who had been trained by Dr. Bredesen. And that was the year he published his very groundbreaking and New York Times bestselling book, The End of Alzheimer's. So he was getting a lot of traffic, and I started to get quite a few patients, and I watched them get better. I saw even very severe cases of dementia improve. Not everyone got 100% better, but I saw the impossible happening before my eyes and regularly. And so it was really after seeing my first patient improve her cognition so significantly and watching it change the quality of her and her husband's life so significantly for the better, that was when I committed my career to supporting people with dementia and their families, their loved ones.
So he writes the book, The End of Alzheimer's. That had to, but well, one, if you're somebody who's experiencing, a loved one with Alzheimer's, you're like beating the streets to get to that book, right? But if you're in the medical community that had already told you like this is not a solvable problem, I have to imagine that book was met with some, we'll call it some resistance. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Tonight I'm up in San Francisco at the moment, and we're going to a movie premiere. Michael Bublé, it's a screening at the San Rafael Film Festival. Michael Bublé was the narrator for the movie Memories for Life. And it, basically goes through Dr. Bredesen's work and interviews patients. I am featured in the film as well because of my work. And so we're here celebrating that. But in the background, where there's a ton of backlash at the moment. And, I can only speculate why people would be trying to suppress such a hopeful message around Alzheimer's, where we have peer-reviewed clinical trials supporting that we're getting these great outcomes. There's conspiracy theories to kind of discuss there with the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, that like all of the powers that be that are invested in the status quo. But my work is dedicated towards changing that narrative because I think I have a moral obligation, right? I've watched people suffering with dementia, suffering with cognitive decline, terrified of what life is going to look like as they age. I have watched them get their lives back, get their cognition back, be able to continue to work or go back to work, remember grandchildren's names. I mean, really meaningful changes in the quality of life of these patients. And I think everyone deserves to know that there are things that you can do for dementia and Alzheimer's.
Wow. Okay. So we've been talking about dementia and Alzheimer's. I think Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. What are kind of the differences that kind of give us the lay of the land?
Yeah, there's some confusing lingo here. So dementia is the umbrella term for the loss of cognition or a decline in condition typically associated with aging. It can also be associated with traumatic brain injuries, and there's different forms of dementia. there's frontotemporal dementia, which became very popular after Bruce Willis was diagnosed with that. And that affects more men than women, frontotemporal dementia. And it's the most common dementia when you're younger. So in the 40s and 50s, in the kind of pre-65 range. And this often is affecting people's behavior. And so unfortunately, it can be diagnosed as schizophrenia or a mental health disorder, not dementia. So it can be misunderstood and misdiagnosed easily. Then there's also Lewy body dementia. This is another very scary one, has a later onset, but is affecting cognition and also behavior. It's often associated with paranoia and hallucinations, and it's really, really challenging for families. Then there are vascular dementias, and Alzheimer's is associated with beta-amyloid plaques and tau proteins, these misfolded proteins. But what I think a lot of people miss is that they all kind of are on top of each other, right? Like if somebody has Lewy body, it doesn't mean they only have Lewy bodies in the brain. That's the pathological, what we would see under the microscope after dissecting their cadaver. But they also probably have some misfolded proteins. The beta-amyloid plaques and the tau proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease are also going to be in the brain of somebody with Lewy body. And somebody with Alzheimer's and a lot of beta-amyloid and tau protein is going to have some Lewy body pathology and some frontotemporal dementia and some, there might even be some Parkinsonian symptoms that are thrown in there. So there is these neurodegenerative diseases. There's a lot of overlap. And I think especially in the conventional medical community, we want to name it. We want to put it in its box. And from our functional medicine perspective, what's most important to me is why. Why is a neurodegenerative process happening? That is what I don't care what you want to call it. I want to know why it's happening so that we can reverse the why and then get improvement in neuronal function, no matter what nerve cell it is or, no matter what the pathophysiological process is happening. That is a downstream effect of a why. There was a causal factor before it. And that is what's most important to me.
So, and I think you kind of mentioned the answer here. There was almost a tenfold. I'm super geeky. So I'm like, Google Trends, like what are people thinking about dementia? And there's this tenfold increase at the kind of the beginning of this year. Share with us. I think you know what that is. And then did that change conversations that you were having kind of with peers or with patients and clients or anything?
Oh, yeah. So this was when I think it came out that Bruce Willis was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever a celebrity kind of gets a diagnosis like that, there's a spike in people searching. I think, he has frontotemporal dementia. So it's a pretty specific type and relatively rare. It does affect men more than women, which is outside of the norm of all of the other dementias affect women more than men. So it didn't, I don't know, it didn't really change the conversations that we were having. I think because I talk about dementia all the time anyways, it didn't really increase that. We just started saying like, oh, and Bruce Willis.
So you may have had like a small increase and not notice it wasn't necessarily on the radar. I think even one of my business partners was like, yeah, his family is doing a lot of posting. And I think that's really good. Like you probably are having kind of more honest conversations with a lot of people. And his is aphasia, I think. At least that word came out, and maybe that's one piece.
Yeah.
How does that fit in kind of with dementia?
Yeah, so aphasia refers to language, right? It's how we're able to speak and communicate through language. And most of the dementias affect language, not all the time. There's kind of a joke in the neurology community that like if you've seen one dementia patient, you've seen one dementia patient because they're all different. Some people are very aware of their cognitive decline. Other people are not aware of it at all. Yeah, some people it affects language. For other people, it affects things spatially. For some people, it's short-term memory. For other people, like their short-term memory is relatively intact, but something else is falling off the cliff. So aphasia refers to language, and certainly Bruce Willis's presentation affected his language significantly.
Does the disease affect men and women different? I mean, you've touched, I think, on this a little bit, but how does it affect men and women differently?
Yeah, so women are 2/3. So 2 out of 3 Alzheimer's patients are female. And there's a lot of speculation about why that might be. Certainly the menopausal transition, that sort of steep drop in estrogen and progesterone, the sex hormones, even pregnenolone, DHEA, the drop in sex hormones that have receptor sites in the brain, right? This is why women experience hot flashes, is because there are estrogen receptors in that temperature set point in the brain. And when not enough estrogen is arriving at those receptors, the women our temperature set point goes crazy and we get hot flashes. And so, we know that there are lots and lots of receptors in the brain for those sex hormones. And when they drop, there seems to be an increase in brain fog and sometimes in cognition that women feel like they never fully recover. So that might be part of it. There are probably other pieces to that puzzle as well. I think that women are also affected not only as patients, but they're more likely to be a caregiver to someone with dementia, an adult parent or a spouse. So if a man gets dementia, usually there's a woman caring for him. So that's another reason that women are more affected by this disease. Additionally, care partners or caregivers to someone with dementia are anywhere from 2.5 to 6 times the risk of developing dementia, becoming a dementia patient themselves compared to people who are not caregivers. So that participation as a care partner increases your risk significantly. And again, women are more likely to be in that role.
Okay, so that's fascinating. 2.5 to 6 times because you're a caregiver. Like, we're looking like contagious, right? Not, right? It's not. But like, do you have any ideas kind of why 2.5 to 6 times is a caregiver 2.5 to 6 times more likely to get dementia or Alzheimer's?
So there's different kind of reasons that are, again, speculated for why this is. I don't know that we know exactly why, but you can kind of just think through if anyone's been a caregiver, even if you've had an infant, right? Like if you've had a child, there's sleep deprivation. When people have dementia, often their sleep cycles are affected, especially in the later stages. So they're up at night. They're confused. You're worried about them eloping or leaving the house and getting lost. So the stress is very high. Often for caregivers, they're not exercising. Sometimes they're socially isolated. They are not eating as well. They're not taking time for themselves. Many caregivers experience guilt if they say hire someone else. They want to be the ones to care for their loved one because they feel like they can do it the best. I'm a parent. I have a 5-year-old daughter. I know that she's going to become more and more and more independent year over year. When you're caring for someone with dementia, it's the opposite. They're becoming more and more dependent, so it's getting harder. It's also very emotionally distressing. If you've, say, had a spouse who has dementia, they go from being a partner to being a dependent. So not only do you not have that person who, he used to take care of the taxes, he used to pay all the bills, I didn't have to worry about that. Now, all of a sudden, you're taking care of the household and you got to pay all the bills. So all of those roles that they took on, now you're taking on. And you're taking on caring for them as well. And potentially they've paid those bills wrong, out of the wrong account and overdrew it, or, they didn't send it. And so now there's all these late fees. So you're having to make up for the deficits in so many ways. I've heard that story so many times. Very fascinating. There was a study out of Utah that 6x risk is high. That highest amount of risk actually comes from a male husband of a female patient with dementia. And so a male spouse incurs the most risk when caring for a wife. And these stressors are very, very real. That's why I mentioned my career is dedicated not just to the patient who has dementia, but often, and you even mentioned this in your intro, it's all of the people around them who are affected so profoundly by this disease. And so getting everyone's support, not just the patient who's been diagnosed with dementia, but also that network around them deserves our support and appreciation.
You are enjoying, well, at least I hope you're enjoying the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you follow, and make sure you share. But don't be that annoying guy, whatever you do. Don't share it with people who aren't actually interested in living beyond the norms. So my next question is about kind of leading risk factors. And I feel like you got into a lot of those when you're talking about caregivers, exercise, social, having social circles, what they're eating, sleeping. You want to dig in. Which one of those would you like to dig into as kind of key leading risk factors?
Yeah. So there was a study in the Lancet in 2020, it was actually a commission report, and it was published right as COVID was sort of at its peak. And so a lot of people missed it, but it was essentially updating the risk, the modifiable risk factors when it comes to dementia. So there's two types of risk factors that we can talk about. One, modifiable. The other is the things that we can do nothing about, right? Age is the number one risk factor. We can't do anything about our chronological age when we were born. Sex is something that we can't really do a whole lot about at this point, if you're in your 60s. So women are at higher risk. We can't modify that. So what we want to focus on is what are all the things that we can modify? And the Lancet came up with a list of 13, and I'll try to remember all of them off the top of my head. But there's some, and I kind of clumped them a little bit differently, but we've found the same patterns as the research is bubbling up. But it's things like smoking, it's air pollution. So this is actually a super interesting kind of statistic to wrap our heads around, Chris, is that the incidence in the first world, so per 100 people, the amount of people diagnosed with dementia is actually declining. The issue is that so much of our population is aging. We have 10,000 people a day turn 65. So we have a huge amount of our population getting older and approaching the baby boomers, basically approaching this stage where they're going to be at highest risk. But in the third world, air pollution contributes to the increasing incidence of dementia. So in the third world, we have increasing incidence. First world, we have declining incidence, but we have an aging population. So big deal all over the world. So what can we do about it? We can avoid cigarettes. So we can avoid air pollution as much as possible as we have control over. And our education level makes a big impact. And this contributes to our cognitive reserve, right? This is the idea that, okay, if you lose a little bit, you've still got plenty there, right? So this is having a college education, having a graduate degree, being a lifelong learner of some sort, learning new languages, learning new skills into your 60s, into that fourth quarter of your life. And then the social isolation we mentioned. So having community, having connections, that plays a big role. Depression. So treating depression, going to therapy, doing what you need to do to treat depression. Depression is associated. It's a little bit chicken and egg. We know that people who have Alzheimer's are often more depressed, but we also know that people who were depressed earlier in life have a higher rate of developing Alzheimer's. Anxiety, that high cortisol, high stress. Cortisol becomes toxic to the hippocampus. It becomes a toxin in the brain if we've got too much of it for too long. Obese, things that we can kind of manage from a medical perspective, things like obesity, hypertension, hearing loss. Hearing loss is associated with dementia. So, getting hearing aids, wearing them, right? Sometimes it's so hard to get people to just wear their hearing aids or put new batteries in them, get them adjusted. We are what comes in. Our brain will atrophy if we aren't getting those stimuli to that area, to that auditory part of the brain. So those are a handful of things. There's, of course, sedentary lifestyle. This has to do with exercise, sleep deprivation, although not listed in the Lancet as one of these 13 causal factor or modifiable risk factors. There's a long discussion about sleep deprivation, and we know that people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, so in midlife and even before, just one night of sleep deprivation leads to a measurable accumulation of beta-amyloid plaques. And so you can imagine if this accumulates over decades, this is going to have structural impacts on the brain to have these misfolded proteins accumulate if you have night after night of sleep deprivation. So sleep is really important. We know obstructive sleep apnea plays a huge role. Hypoxia plays a big role. Traumatic brain injuries play a big role. So there's a lot of pieces. And the way I systematically look at this with patients and with residents at Marama is we say, okay, if you think of your brain like a country, this is Dr. Bredesen, my mentor's analogy. Think of your brain as a country, my Brainistan. And if your brain country is fighting and defending against toxins, against infections, it's not going to have this robust capacity to build roads and schools, right? To put in your infrastructure. You want to be creating those new neurons. You want all of those resources that come to your brain, those minerals and whatever you're making ATP out of, whether it's ketones or glucose, you want to be turning that fuel source into neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters, not into what it takes to fight and defend against toxins and nutrients. So we think about toxins, nutrients. We think about, toxins and infections. You're defending against toxins and infections. Your nutrients are going to help you create the resources that are necessary to do that and to regenerate. So we're thinking about toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure, and infections. And then signaling. Do you have the hormones? We talked a little bit about women being more at risk potentially because of sex hormone dropping, but also thyroid hormone. Vitamin D is a hormone. Do you have all of the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor that comes from your muscles? Is there the testosterone that comes from your muscles? There are receptors in the brain for all of those signals. Do you have enough of those signals arriving and pointing you in the direction of that regeneration, of that infrastructure building? That's the idea.
So I find it amazing that sleep wasn't mentioned. I often reference one of our best testimonials for our product is people take it in the morning and sleep better that night. So sleep is something that I've been digging into. And you may be familiar with Dr. Matthew Walker's work, Why We Sleep.
Yeah.
It's a great book, 25 years of a well-respected institution researcher talking about the detrimental effects of sleep. And he actually got into sleep because he was looking at Alzheimer's, and then he just noticed the negative or the positive correlation of like lack of quality sleep and Alzheimer's. And then he ended up going down the path of sleep. So it's interesting that sleep was not in there. You mentioned beta-amyloid plaque. I listened to a podcast that was talking about a frequency that they actually, they started off with rats. They had lots of beta-amyloid plaque. They put, I think it was a gamma frequency, which is like 40 hertz, I think. And they actually like connected electrodes to these rats' brains, and like in a 1 hour session, like all the like 80% of the beta-amyloid plaques were removed. Then they tried the same experiment, like you're not going to treat people that way, right? Like that's not a very practical solution. Let's, introduce electrodes into the brain, which by the way, had already been genetically modified to be sensitive to light. So they did the same frequency with just light, right? So you have your LED lights flickering. Are you kind of aware of that study or that result?
I am, and that's why I'm fully understanding which one you're referring to. We use the red light, and so red light, through the cytochrome C oxygenase pathways, helps the brain and any cells that you shine it on to more efficiently make ATP. And so we definitely use light therapy, and we discourage people from blue light exposure in the evening so that, red and blue light, different wavelengths of light can affect that signaling. Like, are you going to get enough melatonin to tell your brain that it's time to go to sleep? So we definitely discuss light and our exposure to light. And then with the beta amyloid, there's a ton that we could discuss around beta amyloid. So we all have beta amyloid, right? When you take people from infants to centenarians, there's less than, I think it's like between 1% and 2% of the population that does not have any beta amyloid. So creating beta amyloid is a natural process, and beta amyloid is antimicrobial, right? So this comes up as a way to protect us. Now it is inflammatory, right? It's not something that we want too much of, but it doesn't signal that like beta amyloid is the cause, right? The beta amyloid is responding to something else, just as tau proteins are. So if you had like a house plant, right? And your house plant was dying, you're like, what's going on? Why is my house plant dying? You wouldn't say, oh, it's probably misfolded proteins. You would say, does it have enough light? Is it getting too much or too little? Does it have enough nutrients? Is it being poisoned by something? Is it getting enough water? Does it have enough soil, or does it need a different environment? You would ask the questions that, like, what is going into this living organism, this complex organism? What's going into that's going to affect the health of its cells, the health of the organism? So beta amyloid is not the whole picture, although it's a big part of what we talk about. And there's certainly a connection between amyloid and dementia, Alzheimer's. Everybody has it. And when you look at people over 65, 10% of people over 65 will have measurable cognitive decline or have some subjective experience of cognitive decline. 30% of people over 65 will have enough beta amyloid plaque to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So, and then you have people who are, again, centenarians who pass away with little to no cognitive decline. Many of them have a bunch of amyloid. So they're not equivalent, right? Amyloid doesn't equal Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's, even in and of itself, we talked about how dementia is an umbrella term. If you would have asked, I had, mentors who are MDs in their 70s and 80s. They're like, why is it called Alzheimer's? I thought it was called senile dementia. There is a great book. His name is by, oh gosh, I need my own medicine here. But it's called Carl Haroub. It's called How Not to Study a Disease, the Story of Alzheimer's. And it's essentially talks through why Alzheimer's it's got this great PR company, because it basically has been elevated several times as a marketing ploy, as a way to raise money or sell more books, not as a scientific thing. Right. This is so the NIA could raise more money. It's so pharmaceutical companies can target more patients in a kind of subclinical, like, okay, they're sick people, but without symptoms because they have enough amyloid. They may or may not ever go on to develop any cognitive decline. So in our clinical trial, our focus was not the surrogate marker of beta-amyloid. It was cognition, which is like, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's what matters to people is, can I dress myself? Can I cook for myself? Can I live independently? Can I go to the bathroom on my own? Do I have my dignity at the end of my life? That's what's really important, not the number of beta amyloid, right? It gives us some indication because it's this response to some other cause, but it's not the end all be all. It's not what's important to human beings.
You're touching on some, like, the study, and I definitely want to get into the study. So I'm trying to manage time and see what we should jump into. What are the worst things that we can do if we want to increase our risk of dementia, right? So maybe the positive version of that, or what are the things we absolutely need to cut out so that we can reduce our chances of getting dementia?
Well, like, a standard American life is pretty much a recipe for dementia, right? Like, ultra processed foods, fast food, a sedentary lifestyle, sitting at a desk, being stressed out all day, not getting enough sleep. And of course, like, not having access to medical care to treat your diabetes and hypertension and chronic pain. Dental, not having access to dental work. We know that P. gingivalis or gingivitis is a risk factor for dementia, and that increases inflammation in the cardiovascular system and also in the brain. So, the classic American lifestyle is pretty much a setup for it. So what we want to do is, of course, think through foundations. What are we eating? So whole, unprocessed foods. And I recommend that people suffering with cognitive decline get into ketosis regularly, not be in ketosis all the time, but switch back and forth between a ketogenic diet made of whole foods, not a bunch of keto bars that are full of maltodextrin and dyes, but real whole foods. And then back and forth between that and maybe a Whole30 diet or a Paleo-Mediterranean diet. And then exercise, enough vigorous exercise. And what does that mean? It's about 200 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous exercise. And I recommend switching it up, keep the brain guessing. One of the most important ways we can exercise is something called dual task, or two things at once, where you're cognitively and physically engaged at the same time. And so this, walking and talking is the first classic example of this, but it might also mean going to a Zumba class or ballroom dancing or listening to the cues in a yoga class or a Pilates class. Those are all forms of dual task exercise. I've got great patient stories of creative examples of that, but if you look on YouTube, there's a bunch of examples and ways to do that. But that's one of the ways that we can really get that time that we're spending exercising. We can potentiate it. We can get more from that investment in time if we do the work at the same time with a cognitive and physical exercise. And then sleep. We talked about sleep. I think one of the most important things for someone with experiencing cognitive decline to do is get a sleep study. And I used to wait for people to tell me, oh yeah, I snore. My partner tells me I snore, or wait for them to be male or overweight, or kind of like the classic sleep apnea patient you would think of. I've had too many little sweet ladies who never have snored who have sleep apnea. So now if anyone has any cognitive decline, I have them get a sleep study right away. And thank goodness the technology has gotten so much better that a lot of these can be done, at least a cursory look at sleep can be done at home. You can do these sleep studies. It's not the gold standard of a hospital overnight sleep study, but it's still a way to get an insight into what's going on. Also, I have an Oura ring on right now. A lot of people are wearing Garmin's or Auras or something that's picking up O2 sats with some frequency. Of course, it's not going to rule out sleep apnea all the time, but it might give us an indication that your pulse ox is dropping. Making enough time for sleep, just getting that 7, 8, 9 hours, whatever it is that you need to feel rested, getting enough sleep is ultra important. And then some sort of stress management practice. Now, stress is like Goldilocks, right? Not too much, not too little. You want to, you don't want to turn into a couch potato after retirement. You don't want to have no inputs or no motivation, no sense of purpose. You need something to get up for. And then it's how do we stay engaged? How are we having fun? What can we do? And then, not tip the scales to where we feel so overcommitted that we're taking care of grandkids and taking care of our spouse who has dementia and, taking on some huge project that we don't feel so stretched, that that cortisol becomes toxic. The stress becomes toxic. So it's that middle ground of finding purpose and meaning and probably a prayer or meditation practice. We say the Kirtan Kriya meditation has a ton of data that supports that it's fantastic for so many things, are certainly stress, but also for immune function and cognition and quality of life and activities of daily living, both for people with full-blown dementia, caregivers, and people with early mild cognitive impairment. So across the spectrum. And that's just one form of meditation. There are many, many others. And for those who are interested in more of like a prayer practice, that's another way to cultivate mindfulness and reduce stress. So, diet, exercise, stress, sleep, foundations. And then we start to put like the icing on the cake with saying, okay, are there toxins? Are there nutrient imbalances? Are there infections that we need to go after? Is there dental work that could be done? That's sort of like another level, but you're not going to get, that stuff costs more money and you're going to get the most out of it if you have those foundations, those lifestyle foundations set.
So you mentioned sleep and an Oura ring. You spoke about O2. I don't think, at least I've maybe an older Oura ring. I don't know if the newer Oura ring does a O2. Does it look at O2 or?
Yeah.
It does. Okay.
The newest one does. Yeah.
I need to get the upgrade. I've been putting that off. Actually, I don't have it on right now. It usually sits on this finger because it doesn't charge. Like I need to charge it during the day in order to make it. It doesn't go a full 24 hours. So I've got to be without it.
You're ready for the upgrade.
I definitely need the upgrade.
Ask Santa.
Exactly. So I've got this question because I know in my father's case, there was certainly something that fit in on this. And this was really kind of before he was diagnosed with ALS. And I think he ended up with a frontotemporal, right? That's in charge of executive functions. That's how the ALS physician described it. Are there things the medical establishment kind of thinks about, prescribes, or should be prescribing that they're not doing, that you wish they were doing for, people who have dementia?
Well, Chris, I mean, I don't want to be overly dramatic here, but I think that Dr. Bredesen's approach to dementia, like I feel like we have a moral obligation to teach neurologists about it and that they should know at the very least that it's available and be able to refer people to Bredesen trained providers. And stop telling people there's nothing that you can do. There are medications, the donepezil or Aricept, and then Namenda or memantine. These are two very commonly prescribed medications. And what we see, this was published in the Journal of JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association in December, I think, of 2019, they showed that 5 years after starting Aricept and Namenda, or one or the other or both, people who started those drugs had worse cognition than those who never started them. So I never recommend that anyone jump off of them. Do not do that. That will cause a bigger problem. So I'm not saying to stop those meds. If anything, stay on them. If I'm working with a patient who's on them and we are getting improvements in their cognition and we've been working together for about a year and a half, then I will start to slowly wean them off of those medications. But I do not take anyone off them cold turkey. That does a lot of harm. But I also don't start them on them, because what we see in the data is that not only do they not work? Some people notice a little bit of a bump for the first few months in cognition, but for the most part, people don't notice any benefit. And 5 years later, they're worse off. So I think that we should stop prescribing them. I don't think that that's very helpful for people. And then the other thing is these new medications, they're IVs, Aduhelm, aducanumab, Leqembi, lecanemab. These have been approved by the FDA, and Leqembi or lecanemab is being covered by Medicare. This is appropriate for people who are in the earlier stages. They need to be close to a medical facility because there are risks of both brain bleeding and brain swelling. And so that needs to be managed appropriately, that including MRIs, imaging, and visits with the doctor to make sure that that's not becoming more harmful. Now, what's the upside of these? They're very expensive. They requires a lot of medical management. And what they do is they slow progression. So what we found in our clinical trial is that people had an improvement in cognition. Leqembi or lecanemab slows a torturous process down. So you don't have the benefit of getting better. You just end up in this awful situation longer, if things go well.
It's like the train wreck, right? Watching the train wreck, but the train is going slower as opposed to, hey, why don't we stop it and have it back up a little bit? Yeah, I think at least my answer to that is obvious. All right, so I want to jump into the clinical trial because you did kind of a multi-factor approach. Talk a little bit about that. Fascinating to even do a clinical trial. Like that's something a lot of people never kind of don't have under their belt, including me yet. So talk about that trial and kind of the results of it.
Yeah, I feel so fortunate. So I had a philanthropist who I saw as a patient, and he asked me, how can I help you? And I said, well, I keep getting this question from patients is, if I do this for my loved one, if I spend the money, if I put the effort in, if I take the time to do this Bredesen approach, how likely is it that we're going to get benefit? And I was like, I have no idea. I know some people get better because I've seen it, but I have no idea if it's half, if it's 20%, if it's 80%. I didn't know what to tell them. And so that was immediately what I told the philanthropist. I was like, this would be the best thing if I could do a trial and basically be able to publish it and then be able with integrity to say to my patients or potential patients, this is the likelihood that this is going to work. And what we found after taking 23 participants through a 6-month trial, we threw everything at it. So it's basically Dr. Bredesen's approach is taking all of functional medicine, doing all the testing. And at the end of 6 months, we saw that 17 of the 23 were better. So 74% of our participants were better. And now I can tell patients that if your MoCA score, if when you start, MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, it's a way that we put a number on someone's cognition. Perfect score is 30. It's a 1-page worksheet where you identify zoo animals, you draw a clock, you say, the name, where you are and the date and time. And on that, we took patients who had MoCA scores of 12 to 23. So normal is 26 and above. 12 to 23 is measurable cognitive impairment. So people either on their way to Alzheimer's diagnosis or actually who had an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And so with that, what we found was that 17 of them improved, and we had across the mean change, we had statistically significant improvement in both memory and overall composite cognition, and improvement in all of the categories of cognition that we measured. So although not all of it was statistically significant, we hope with a larger sample size it would be. This trial was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease in August of 2023. And a year before, in July of 2022, Kat Toops and Dr. Dale Bredesen, his team, published a very similar trial. They took 25 participants through a 9-month intervention, and they showed that 84% of them improved. So the differences between the two trials was, one, that our trial was only a 6-month intervention, and our participants had MoCA scores between 12 and 23. So they were more severe compared to the Bredesen and Toops trial, which had taken people with MoCA scores down to 19. So they had less severe impairment, and they did a 9-month intervention. So it kind of makes sense that 84% of their participants got better and only 74% of our participants got better. In both cases, this is so hopeful. What we see is that more often than not, people get better when they do this.
All right. So that's fascinating. I love clinical trials. At some point, I'm going to do a clinical trial myself with my company. Time for the wrap-up questions. And the first question is, do you have a target age that you want to live to?
Yeah, I'd love to live to 125. I had my daughter when I was 35, and I would just love to be around and see her live to be 90 and, just to get old and have, spend time with future generations, see what happens to the world. 125 feels like a good age for me.
All right, 125. And how long do you think humans can live?
I think 125 is kind of like the max that we've experienced as of yet. But I think that there's a lot of really exciting research, and certainly with AI and the speed of which we're learning things, I wouldn't be surprised if that changes soon.
And what are 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets, let's call them shortcuts, to longevity and a long health span that you would share?
Meditation. I think that meditation is by far the best medicine. It certainly has been for me personally. And I think that modulating stress, managing stress, knowing that things are going to kind of maintaining that equanimity no matter what life throws at you, I think is one of the secrets to a long and well-lived life. I think diet is the next one, eating whole foods, unprocessed foods, not necessarily going to the grocery store whole foods, because there's a lot of junk in there. But eating foods as they have come out of the ground, off the tree, straight from the animal, if you're open to eating animal products, I think that is part of it. And then movement, sleep and movement, but particularly movement. Our bodies are designed to move. So some sort of movement, and particularly with other people, I think games and sports and enjoying others, connecting with others and moving is helpful and part of living a long, healthy life.
All right, Dr. Sandison, how can people contact you?
Yeah, so you're welcome to join me and my community at drheathersandison.com. We have a newsletter to keep people updated about the latest science and what you can do to protect your brain and avoid dementia as you age. I also have a book coming out called Reversing Alzheimer's that'll be out with HarperCollins June of 2024.
And what in the near future are you excited about?
Yeah, we're excited about expanding Marama, getting more people access to the senior living community that I think everyone with suffering with memory concerns deserves. That good brain healthy food, brain healing activities during the day, encouragement to connect with others and engage in the movement and the lifestyle that's associated with healthy aging and cognition, optimal cognition as we age. So I think expanding access to Marama. Right now we only have 27 beds in the whole world that are dedicated to this approach to senior living. And I think that we could have one in every city supporting those who are approaching that age where they're at the most risk and in need of not just memory care, but memory recovery.
So that makes perfect sense. You can find her at drheathersandison.com. She's got the book coming out. You go to Dr. Heather Sandison to find her other links. Dr. Sandison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Such a privilege, Chris. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.